If you're installing vinyl plank flooring for the first time, knowing how to make the right cuts is a key to a successful install. I'm going to show you how to make all the cuts that you'll need to get it right and the tools that you need to do it from DIY to pro. So let's go ahead and jump into the cuts. And the ones that I'm going to show you are cutting to length, cutting to width, doing notches on corners, on sides, cutting curves, and cutting holes. And that's everything that you're going to need for your successful install. The cut that you're going to be making the most is cutting a plank to length. And that's because at the end of every row, you're going to have a little spot that is going to be smaller than a full length plank. So an easy way to do that is to go ahead and use a tape measure. You can go and look at there. I've got 13 3/4 here, but remember, look at the manufacturer's recommendations for gap that you need for expansion. This one says 1/4 inch. So I would go 13 1/2 versus 13 3/4. So I could easily measure that and mark that. But there's an easier way to do that. I'm just going to take the plank, put it in the orientation that I'm going to have it installed, and then flip it around end for end. Now what I can do is butt it up against my wall. Then I'm going to back it off 1/4 inch for that expansion joint. Now all I have to do is mark right where the underlying plank is, and that's my cut mark. Now the most basic way to make the cut is just with a utility knife or a box cutter. So I've got this marked, and now I can use a straight edge. I have carpenter square here. A 6-inch carpenter square is going to be too small for this specific piece because it's 8 inches. So I'm going to use a 12-inch one. And I can line the carpenter square up on my mark. When you're holding this, you want to hold it at the top so that the carpenter square will not slip on you. But the other important thing is make sure you're not cutting right on top of the flooring you just installed. What I like to do is take a little offcut, and you can put that underneath it. And that way, when you're scoring your line, the razor blade is going to come off and it's going to hit the scrap, and it's not going to hit your brand new floor and mess it up. And a tip, don't go back over it, because if you go back over it, it could stray and you're going to have a cut that's not as nice. If you use a tapping block, that is a great thing to get leverage with. So I can feel underneath, I can feel the score line. I'm going to put the tapping block right across there, and it just gives it support across that break line. Put some pressure on it. Now I can just pull up, and it breaks right along that line. So it's a nice clean snap. Sometimes you'll have this that'll stay attached, and you just can score that with the razor blade as well. But now I can flip it back around, and it fits right in place. That piece was about 13 inches, so I had a nice leverage to be able to pull up. Let's say that I had just a 4-inch piece to make. So if I had a little 4-inch line here, and the problem is as it gets smaller, it gets harder to break, because now I've only got this. If the piece is longer, I've got a nice little arm, lever arm to pull up on it. But on this little piece, I'm gonna try to break this. I can't quite do it because I need a little bit longer there. The way that I've done this in the past, I've used a miter saw. Miter saws work great for this. They are very messy though. But you could use a circular saw, you could use a hand saw, you could use a jigsaw, you can use a lot of different methods to do this. But there is one different technique that you can use, a laminate tile cutter. Now I'm going to show you one that I bought it off Amazon for about $100. I'll have a link down below in the description to it, as well as all the other tools that I'm using here. All right, so this is a 13-inch siding and laminate cutter. And basically it has just got a big long lever arm that is attached to a blade. You put the piece in and you just chop it down, just guillotine style, and it will come right off. The beauty of this is that you can go as small of a cut as you want. Now what I've noticed is it does leave the backing attached most of the time, but you look at that's like a 3/4 inch cut there. And then all you have to do is separate that backing with your razor blade, and then you have it. So if we compare this cut that I just made right here, you can see this nice, super crisp, clean line versus this one that I made with the snapping, and especially on the back. You can see it's kind of all tore up here. It's a little bit jagged. Not a huge big deal because most of this is going to be covered, but you definitely do get a cleaner line when you're using the vinyl plank cutter. Another cool thing about this cutter is that if you have angled cuts, it makes those pretty easy as well. So it could be something to consider if you have a really big job to do, or if you're going to be doing a lot of jobs on your own for friends and family or different rooms in your house. And the next cut is cutting planks to width. Now you're not going to have to do this very often. You probably have to do it at the beginning of the install and the end, and then if you have any juts out in the room, you might have to do that as well. So what we need to do is cut the board down the length. And so this one, you can't really do that with a box cutter. And the reason is what I showed earlier is the leverage. So we could score a line, but then snapping it would be very difficult. And I tried that, and it didn't go so well. Now you can use a handsaw, something like this that comes with a miter box or any other type of handsaw, but I don't think that that's a really great option because the teeth are really fine. And if you can see what I'm doing here, when you're cutting, it's going to take a really long time, especially if you have a long wall that you're doing this for and have to cut 3 or 4 planks. It's going to take you a while to do. So if you have a really tight budget, you can use a handsaw, but a much better option is to use a circular saw or a jigsaw. This is a cordless model here. This will work fine as well, and really you can use any blade, so you don't have to worry about any of that. One thing that I like to do is get it out of the room you're installing in so you're not making all that dust. I like to come down to my workshop and do it, or you could set it up outside as well. I also use a piece of 1-inch rigid foam insulation as a backer, so that way I can put it on my bench here and not worry about cutting into the bench. Now when you put this in place, you do want to clamp it down so it's not going to move, and also you want to make sure that the blade is set to just a bit below the thickness of the actual piece there. So you don't need to have a lot of the blade exposed to do this. Now this is going to make a mess like I said, but it's going to be a really clean cut. So using a circular saw would be great. You can get an inexpensive model of a circular saw for about 50 bucks. Another great way to do it is to use a jigsaw. Now this is what we used at my brother-in-law's house when we were there because he didn't have a circular saw on hand. Now you can get an inexpensive jigsaw for about 40 bucks, and you can also use that for some of the other cuts I'm going to tell you about in a minute. Now the downside of a jigsaw is that if you're cutting the length of it, it is a lot slower, especially if you do not have one where you can adjust the orbital action on the jigsaw. But it does do a great job of making that cut. So jigsaw is a great alternative if you've already got one of those and you don't want to invest in a circular saw. Now the next cut that we're going to talk about is cutting notches on the corners of planks. And basically you'll have to do this anytime you have a bump out anywhere in your room. Now I've had to do this around cabinetry. I've also had this on corner walls that stick out. So unless your room's just a complete rectangle, you'll probably have to do this. Okay, so if we've laid a row, we're up against our wall and we have a little bump out here, then all we're going to have to do is we're going to cut our first piece to length. I'm going to flip it around, and I'm going to go all the way to the wall. Don't go up against the bump out or you'll cut it too short. So I'm going to go against the wall, pull it back 1/4 of an inch, make my mark. I pull the vinyl cutter up here. I'm just going to line it up on my mark, cut this to length. So now I can put it in place, and you need to mark the length of it as well as the width of the notch. So I'm going to line it straight up with the end where it's going to get installed. And now again, I'm going to make a little mark about a 1/4 inch off of this piece. Right now I'm going to bring it back and put it in line with the piece that it's going to be installed up against over here. Line it up and again give myself that 1/4 inch. Now all I have to do is draw straight lines and connect them, and then I know what I need to notch out. You can make these cuts with something like a handsaw. I like this little guy right here. I'll make one side of the cut with this one, and then on the other side I will use a jigsaw just to show you the difference. So linking those two cuts together now, I can put it in place and it should fit right around my notch. There we go. It's ready to bang in and you're getting locked in. So my choice for sure on this one would be the jigsaw, but again, you can use the handsaw if you don't want to invest in that. And the next type of cut is going to be for a side notch. So instead of it being in the corner, you might have it right in the middle of the board. Now we ran into this in my brother-in-law's house on a closet. So let's assume this is a wall. We're laying planks in and this comes around and the wall comes in on the closet side. So if you have an opening in a closet and you're going around that, this will be an area where you would likely have this situation happen. So here's how we lay it out. I'm going to use this same plank as before, and instead of having that bump out down here, we'll have the notch in the middle. So I'm going to line this one up. It's obviously already cut to size, so we would have already done that. I'm going to put it right where it's going to be installed on the left-hand side here, and then I'm just going to butt it right up against that notch. Now all I have to do is make my little marks for the cutout. So now I have the width of the notch, and all I have to do for the depth of the notch is measure from that distance there. So that's 5 1/8 of an inch on both sides. So I'm going to make that about 4 7/8, or about 5 inches. Make sure you're measuring from the edge of the top here where it's going to connect and not from the edge of the tongue or the groove. Now I can lay out my lines to establish where this cut goes and make an easy cut. And one tip that I like to use here is cutting over a garbage can. And this is especially useful if you're doing it in the room where you're installing, because all the dust will go down into the garbage can. So I'm going to do it with the jigsaw. Again, you can do it with the handsaw that I just showed a moment ago, but I'll also show you a little trick that a handsaw won't let you do. So So let me cut the edges first. Okay, now that I've got my sides cut, I have to cut on the inside. And this will be very difficult to do with a handsaw. You basically have to make some relief cuts, and to get in there, you're gonna have to do a lot of extra cutting. With a jigsaw, and I've got a small blade on it, I can put those relief cuts in very quickly and then get a straight line. Check out how this works on the jigsaw. It's real quick. With a little bit of work on the jigsaw, this should fit right around my bump out. Now, I moved that. Did I move that? Oh. All right, do as I say, not as I do. That is a mistake that you could easily make, which I have just made for you. There you go. Mistakes were made. That is a theme on this channel. So when I measured the 5 inches from here, guess what? I measured it from the other side. I should have measured from the side that I took the measurements on. I like to sometimes put these mistakes in my videos so I can share with you things that might happen because, you know, I would never make those mistakes. So when you take that measurement, make sure you reference it from the right side. So that little mistake brings up a good subject as well. When you're getting material, make sure you get about 10% extra. And that is just for little things like this that might happen. And sometimes it's not as easy to move a wall to make it fit. Get that extra material, and if you have a full box that you can return later, no problem. But you don't want to get stuck not having the material on hand and having to extend into another day of doing the work. And the next one we're going to talk about is cutting curves. You're probably not going to run into curves a lot unless you're doing like around a column in a basement, or if you're in a bathroom. If you're in a bathroom, you will definitely have to cut around the toilet flange. So I've got a gallon of paint here, which will be our stand-in for the toilet flange. Now it's kind of tricky to measure around that because you can't really get in and take great measurements around it. But there is a cool little gadget for that if you're into gadgets. This is a contour gauge. And there's a lot of these different ones in there. I'll have this one linked down below. But it does a good job for what it is. And if you mess around with it, you can get the exact measurement. So I'm just going to push that out a little bit. I'm going to kind of mess with it just a little bit because these like to flex out. And so I'm going to account for that a little bit here, push everything in. And that's a pretty good representation, I think, of the size of the can. So now I have this exact curve that'll fit around the can. I can actually lock this in place with these guys so it won't move if it gets bumped. Now I can mark it on my plank where it needs to go, starting at the right distance from the can. I can take this up against the can and see right where it's going to hit. So it's going to hit right here, so I know that's my center line. Now I can measure from the can to the plank, which is about 5 1/4. So we're going to make this 5, and we are going to make it from this end so we don't make that same mistake twice. So we're going to measure about 5 here. And now I know that my curve is going to go right around that. So I can put the contour gauge right on top of that, center it up the best I can. And again, this is not long enough to go all the way around, so I'm going to have to eyeball it a bit, but I'm just going to follow that radius around, something like this. Now I can cut this with the jigsaw and we'll see how the fit is, but the jigsaw is going to be by far and away the easiest to cut a curve with. I did adjust my lines a little bit because I think I got a little wide when I was tracing that, but having a small blade here also is going to help. The more narrow the blade, the tighter the curve you can cut. So I can bring this back over and line it up, and hopefully I didn't move anything out of the way. And apparently I did not overestimate that. So I do need to take a little bit more off on those corners. The nice thing is if you're doing something like this, undercutting is better than overcutting. So if you're going to mark it, then go back and adjust it a little bit wider, not a problem. And there we go. It could be widened up a little bit more here on the sides, but that's just what you're going to do is just go trim a little bit more until you get it so that you want to get that a little bit better. Now the last cuts we're going to talk about are cutting holes. I've had to do holes in both of the installs that I've done. One was for a drain pipe that was in the laundry room, and I had to measure for that, and I used a Forstner bit to cut that out. The great thing is that for this vinyl plank flooring, you can just use regular woodworking tools like drill bits. You don't have to do anything special like a masonry bit or anything like that. You can just use a regular drill bit like a spade bit or a Forstner bit to get that done. And a more common thing that you might have to make a hole for would be a air vent. We also had to do that at my brother-in-law's house. Sometimes the air vent is gonna fall right in the center of your plank. Sometimes it'll be on the side and you can use the side notch approach that we've already looked at, but sometimes it's gonna fall right in the middle. Now all you have to do that is use the techniques that we've shown just to get some measurements of exactly where that's gonna fall. And let's just assume that our air vent is the size of this 2x4 here. So we can lay out the measurements, get that. I'm gonna go ahead and mark it. So the last tool that I'm going to show you is a multi-tool, and a multi-tool is great for plunge cutting. You can also do the curves and other things with it. You can actually even do straight line rips, but I just want to show you another option. With a jigsaw, you could also drill a hole here and use that as a starter hole and then use your jigsaw the rest of the way. So you can absolutely do this with a jigsaw. But let me show you the multi-tool because it's another great option to have. I just have a wood and metal blade on here. I should have had my safety glasses on when I was using the jigsaw, so make sure you wear that. Also, these things are pretty loud, so I went ahead and put ear protection on. But you could just plunge right in there. You don't have to have any starter holes, and you could just cut around just like this. Now the oscillating tool does tend to melt the vinyl a little bit, so it's not as much cutting as it is sometimes melting. So you might have to give it a little pop to get that little center out. And then there you go, you've got your hole to go right around your vent. Another great thing about these multi-tools is you can use them for undercutting door jambs to slide it under, so you can get multiple purposes out of this. That's why they call it a multi-tool. So if you're only going to invest in one tool, my recommendation would be the jigsaw. I have a link down below for a cheap version as well as one that's got a little more features on it. But this will do everything you need it to and can make all the cuts for your vinyl plank flooring. And then you pair that with just a utility knife for the end cuts and you're good to go with a little investment. Hey, if you've not checked out my videos on how to install vinyl plank flooring, I've got 2 of them queued up for you right there over in the playlist and some mistakes to avoid. I want to give a big thank you to all the people that have been joining the Builders Club, and I'll see you guys on the next video.